Good afternoon. Day 4, Black History Month. The black blogger Joe Hall, the black man who reads aloud. Chapter 4, The Danger of Freedom, Reconstruction in America. The reign of terror is set up in this county. I will not undertake to give a minute description of it. Time and space is not sufficient. Suffices to say that the history of the darkest ages of the world does not, in my estimation, afford a parallel. Joe Easley, a free man living in Sulphur Springs, Texas, said this on July 17, 1868. In chapter 4, we will be talking about political violence, economic intimidation, enforcing racial social order, organized terror and community massacres, accusations of crimes, and arbitrary and random violence. Just by daring to venture into the light of freedom and opportunity, black men, women, and children who exercise the rights gained through federal legislation and the Reconstruction Amendments 13th, 14th, and 15th became targets of deadly racial violence wielded by white people determined to ensure freedom would be anything but a joyful story. Individually and in mobs, white people attacked and killed black people throughout the South for leaving their plantations and participating in politics and asserting economic independence. Others were maimed or killed for small social infractions or merely for being associated with someone accused of an offense. Reconstruction violence targeting black people also occurred in the North, less frequently but often with the same motivations. Some violence had no trigger at all, and those seemingly random and arbitrary attacks were an especially terrifying tool of control and intimidation. For all that we can never know about the countless undocumented acts of violence and unknown victims, the narratives we do know illustrate the suffering and survival of people who had already endured so much. All told, Reconstruction was the darkest page in the saga of American history. Eric Foner, historian. Political violence. The 15th Amendment and federal laws requiring states to respect the voting rights of black men enabled unprecedented numbers of African Americans to cast votes and hold elective office in the South. Black voters overwhelmingly supported candidates allied with the visions of President Lincoln and others who advocated for black civil rights. White Southerners bitterly resisted black voters' growing political influence, which they saw as an obstacle to restoring former Confederate self-governance, and blamed black voters for white supremacist candidates' repeated losses. To suppress political reform and hinder black political development, white mobs targeted black American leaders and political officials, as well as black community members who worked to encourage black political engagement. Guilford Coleman. In 1870, Guilford Coleman, a black delegate to the Alabama State Convention, was abducted from his home and killed the week he returned from nominating a Reconstruction governor in Demopolis. Investigations into Mr. Coleman's murder were minimal, but reports indicated he was beaten and dumped into a well solely for his political involvement. Reports warned that pro-Reconstruction politicians dare not canvass the district lest they lose their lives. Jack Dupree. In 1871, 60 members of the Ku Klux Klan brutally lynched Jack Dupree, the well-respected black president of a local political club in Monroe County, Mississippi. The mob dragged Mr. Dupree from his home within sight of his 3 children and his wife, who had recently given birth to twins. The mob stripped Mr. Dupree of his clothes and beat him until he was nearly dead, then slit his throat, cut out his heart and intestines, and threw his corpse into a nearby creek. Mr. Dupree's remains were never found, but a witness who was forced to hold the mob's horses described the attack and recalled hearing his screams. Joe Cody. Attacks on political leaders and organizers were meant to intimidate black people and keep them from leading their community to political empowerment. But black people also were targeted simply for voting. In 1868, a black man named Joe Cody refused white residents' command that he vote for a pro-white supremacy ticket in Warren County, Georgia. In response, a group of white men seized Mr. Cody from his home, whipped him, and pulled out his hair. Lewisburg, Tennessee. In January of 1868, according to a report to the Tennessee Freedmen's Bureau officials, a mob of 25 white men terrorized the black community in Lewisburg to intimidate black voters. They told us to put up our right hand and swear that we would never again give a radical a vote. And if any of us did, they would kill us. And furthermore, if any colored man knew of another colored man voting in the radical ticket, he also would be killed unless he informed of the colored man who so voted. Then they told us to go home and never leave it unless we got a pass from our employers, and the same as we used to get from our master before the war. The mob also severely beat and threatened to lynch a black man named Wesley Gibbons before removing the rope from around his neck and ordering him to leave the area within 8 days. Abbeville, South Carolina. In Abbeville, South Carolina, white mobs injured many African Americans in attacks before the 1868 election and declared that anyone who voted for the civil rights ticket would be killed. The hostility and anger directed at the increased status and rights of black people also sparked attacks against black people asserting their political rights in the North. On October 10, 1871, African-American activist and Union Army veteran Octavius Cato left the Philadelphia school where he served as a teacher and administrator and headed to the polls to cast his ballot in the city's mayoral election. The election was only the second in Philadelphia to allow African-American men to vote, and local white voters, threatened by the emergence of a new African-American voting bloc, tried to suppress the black vote with violence. Beginning days before the election, white policemen and mobs terrorized the black community. On the morning of the election, several African-American men were shot and some were killed simply for being on the streets on election day. Despite these dangers, 31-year-old Mr. Cotto was determined to exercise his vote. A northern man with southern roots, Mr. Cotto's family had moved north from South Carolina after his father's emancipation from slavery, and he had grown into an active advocate for equal rights. In 1863, he helped to organize black infantry units and aggressively lobbied for their inclusion in the Union military effort. 3 years later, he staged a one-man protest against Philadelphia's segregated streetcars. Mr. Cotto successfully cast his vote in the mayoral election on October 10, 1871, but on his way home from the polls, he was shot and killed by Frank Kelly, a white man with ties to white supremacist party leaders. Though Kelly was arrested and tried for murder, he was acquitted by an all-white jury. Economic intimidation. In the years following the Civil War, many black people were violently attacked or killed for trying to leave the plantation of their former white masters. For every black person injured or killed in one of these attacks, many more were terrorized by the message that acting free would get them killed. White resistance to emancipation sought to preserve the racial hierarchy and economic exploitation of enslavement by depriving emancipated men and women of their most basic rights to choose where to live and where to work. In 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau documented multiple examples of such attacks in Texas alone. Near Mill Creek, a white man shot and killed a black man named King Davis for attempting to leave the land where he had been enslaved. In Liberty County, a white a white man handcuffed and brutally beat Bryan and his wife after their 2 sons left the plantation without the farmer's permission. And when a black woman named Selena Parker made plans to move to Houston, the white man who had once been her owner beat her severely, stole her money and clothes, and kidnapped her child. Also in 1865, Union General and future Senator Carl Hertz reported to Congress on the conditions facing black people in the South. He warned that white people's determination to retain control over black people was sparking widespread violence. There existed a desire to preserve slavery in its original form as much as in as long as possible. The white people still indulged in the lingering hope slavery might yet be preserved, or to introduce into the new system that element of physical compulsion which would make the Negro work. The main agency employed for that purpose was force and intimidation. In many instances, Negroes who walked away from plantations or were found upon the roads were shot or otherwise severely punished, which was calculated to produce the impression among those remaining with their masters that any attempt to escape from slavery would result in certain destruction. A large proportion of the many acts of violence committed is undoubtedly attributable to this motive. In Walker County, Texas, a white mob with a pack of hunting dogs tracked down a black man named Isaac and shot him for leaving a plantation where he had been enslaved. Violence in response to black economic independence continued throughout the South for years after the abolition of slavery. In September of 1867, a white man in Wilmington, North Carolina, assaulted a black man named John Henry Hill because he insisted on being paid for his work. That year in Washington, Louisiana, the local constable shot a black man named John Keller 5 times, tied him to a horse, and beat him to death. The constable was Mr. Keller's employer and killed him for traveling to visit his sick wife after he was denied permission to go. In 1872, Congress heard testimony about the violent raid in Nauscee County, Mississippi. According to witnesses, a band of about 20 men in disguise took over several plantations to straighten out the niggers and to make the Negroes subservient by instilling fear. The mob whipped 25 or 30 people in the area and shot and killed a black man named Dick Malone, who had encouraged black men to arm themselves and, if the white men came around, to give them a fight. One of the testifying witnesses was a white man named John Taliaferro, who had participated in the violence before turning informant. This raid and others, he explained, aimed to terrify black people into fleeing the land they were renting so they'd be forced to work for white planters. After such an attack, he went on, black people who heard about the violence would leave their homes and sleep in the woods to evade roaming night raids. Taliaferro also testified many of the county's most prominent citizens and landowners were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Though not free by law, most enslaved people were not safe to exercise even the most basic expression of their freedom by leaving the sites of their former bondage and making independent economic choices. Aside from limited arrests and prosecutions undertaken by federal officials, the vast majority of white individuals and mobs that committed violence against black people faced no consequence and no fear of punishment, enforcing the racial social order. Beyond economic and political control, white Southerners used violence to punish perceived transgressions of racial social boundaries. During Reconstruction, many African Americans were beaten or killed for minor social transgressions against white people, such as speaking disrespectfully, refusing to step off the sidewalk, arguing, bumping into, or insulting a white person, or any other grievance a white man, woman, or child claimed. Black people knew that they could be attacked or killed for violating any social rule, intentionally or accidentally, as defined by any white person at any time. One summer evening in 1865, married couple Ed and Jenny Scott were walking down Main Street in Richmond, Virginia with 2 friends. The 4 black people parted to allow 2 white men in Confederate uniforms to pass. but the men were outraged that they had not stepped off the sidewalk. One of them hit Jenny Scott in anger, and she fled for safety. Her husband came to her defense, warning the white man, "If you strike her again, I will strike you." In response, a white mob seized Mr. Scott and beat him severely, tortured him for hours, and took him away in a partially sealed coffin. Reporting the attack to the Freedom Bureau officials several days later, Mrs. Scott said that she has not seen her husband since. In Georgia in 1867, a white man stabbed a black man named Andrew Price for not bringing him a cup of coffee fast enough. Another white man shot a black man named Hilliard Thatcher in the back for contradicting him. In 1865, a black man named Plain Stanley was standing outside church services in East Liberty, Texas, when a white man stabbed him, cursing, "God damn your black soul. I will learn you to stand in the way of white ladies." In 1866, a white man in Grayson County, Texas, shot and killed a black man named Jack Stone for failing to tip his hat. In the same county the previous year, a white man shot and killed a black man named Thomas Daniels when he refused to change how he was doing his work. For being rude to his white employer, Roland Carswell was beaten, attacked with a knife, and fired at with a shotgun in Daugherty County, Georgia in 1868. Throughout the former Confederacy, white people were determined to maintain social dominance of white supremacy, and they were willing to kill to do it. One of the racial boundaries white men protected most fiercely was the prohibition on sexual, romantic, or any intimate contact between black men and white women. For decades before emancipation, the strongest and most fervent arguments against abolishing slavery claimed that freeing black people would leave white women vulnerable to black men's alleged sexual aggression and result in rampant race mixing and a collapse of the civilization. When freedom did come, any white person's perception that a black man was seeking intimacy with a white woman could result in deadly mob violence. Sax Joyner was lynched in Unionville, South Carolina in March of 1865, just weeks before the end of the Civil War. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation, Mr. Joyner, a literate and skilled black carpenter, was still enslaved by a white master. The master found a note Mr. Joyner had written to a white girl staying in the home, offering her protection from the Yankees, and interpreted it as a sexual advance. The white man had Mr. Joyner arrested. Soon after, the local white men abducted Mr. Joyner from the jail and hanged him from a tree. In May of 1866, Tom Conyers, a black man, was accused of offering a white girl a dime to have sex with him and repeated the proposition when she refused. As Mr. Conyers was being escorted from the courthouse to the jail in Daviess County, Kentucky, a mob, including a former Confederate soldier and the white girl's father, seized and hanged him from a tree. In Orange County, North Carolina in 1869, after a mixed-race man named Cyrus Guy allegedly made a snide remark to a white woman, a white mob hanged him from a tree at a busy intersection and left him for days beneath a message written in blood to warn other mulattoes to know their place. It read, "For assaulting white ladies." Purportedly committed to protect white women and to prevent interracial sex, this violence was steeped in hypocrisy. Before and after emancipation, the same communities that lynched black men for the mere allegations of impoliteness or insults toward white women ignored and excused white men's blanket sexual attacks against black women and girls. Sex traders regularly raped the women they purchased. One Freeman told of a trader who sexually assaulted a black woman and a group of enslaved people he was preparing to sell, and then allowed his companions to do the same for several days before she went to auction. These attacks persisted during Reconstruction, unchecked and unpunished. Organized terror and community massacres. As terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan gained prominence and boldness in the years following the Confederacy's defeat, they regularly waged raids on entire communities, targeting black leaders and leading a message of intimidation and fear to all people, all black people. In January of 1869, Daniel Blue testified against Klan members accused of burning the home of another black person in North Carolina. A mob of Klansmen retaliated by breaking into Daniel Blue's home one night and murdering his pregnant wife before setting upon the couple's children, killing all 5. One Klansman reportedly murdered the last child by kicking his brains out with the heel of his boot. Commonly wide massacres grew terrifying in their frequency as individual incidents of violence escalated into large-scale attacks. White mobs destroyed property and killed dozens or even hundreds of African Americans just for being black and within reach. The white press often labeled these events as riots, even though they rarely featured mutual combat or white casualties, more accurately described as massacres. These lawless bloodbaths left many black people dead and injured and saddled black communities with trauma that endured for generations. Though it is difficult to accurately quantify the total number of blacks killed in these mass attacks during Reconstruction, the era is full of documented massacres with staggering death tolls in communities including Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana in 1866, Opelousas, Louisiana, and Milliken, Texas in 1868, Union County, South Carolina in 1871, Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, and Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1874. These attacks reflected the ease with which white resentment erupted into death and destruction for black communities and the relative impunity for which their violence spread. The frequency of mass murders ensured that no black person could escape the constant threat of terror. Accusations of crimes. Many black people killed during Reconstruction were lynched after being accused of a crime and before receiving any trial or fair investigation. Though functioning courts and jails existed in most southern communities, many black suspects were deprived of the due process rights their citizenship now guaranteed, especially when they were accused of an offense against a white person. Indeed, white mobs and their defenders regularly justified deadly attacks as necessary to curb and punish black criminality that would otherwise run rampant now that black people had been freed. A review of the 1919 book, The Truth About Lynching in the Negro in the South, summarized the author's argument that the lynching of black men prevents their becoming over dangerous to the white South. Allegations of black men raping white women, the book authors concluded, needed to be punished by periodic lynching, preferably by burning. Punished at the early 20th century peak of racial terror lynching, such assertions were rooted in the bloodshed that emerged during Reconstruction. In August of 1874, an armed group of several hundred white men abducted 16 African-American men from jail in Trenton, Tennessee, after they were accused of shooting at 2 white men. 6 of the men were riddled, found lying along a nearby road. 4 were dead, their bodies riddled with bullets, while the other 2 were severely wounded and later died after receiving medical attention. The other 10 black men abducted from the jail were eventually discovered drowned at the bottom of a nearby river. The dead were reported as Bob Baton, Stephen Bryant, Jared Burroughs, George Green, Bill Ivey, Nick Ivey, Doug Jameson, Bob Love, William McGee, Hayes Pebbles, John Regan, Dick Shaw, Tom Shelton, Alfred Williams, and Dan Williams. Soon after this mass lynching, a local newspaper published a letter from a white resident that excused the mob's murderous actions as self-defense and insisting that the black men, these incarnate devils, had received the punishment they richly deserved. The letter declared without evidence that if allowed to live, the black men might have violated the persons of a dozen ladies, burned 100 homes, and killed as many men. Forged after emancipation and used to fuel the growth of prisons, convict leasing, and racial terror lynching, the stereotype of innate black criminality produced the presumption of guilt that burdened black men, women, and children in the U.S. for years to come. It is impossible to give the number of Negroes that have been killed. There is a great many missing that have not been heard from. The freed people have had all their arms taken away from them, and they are in the most deplorable conditions of any people on earth. All that were living in the county by themselves have been robbed of everything of the least value, even taking the underdressing of freed women, their bedclothes, in a word, everything of the smallest value, and then driven from their homes into the woods. It is the most sickening sight I have ever witnessed to see. Freeman's Bureau Correspondent, Hopkins County, Texas, July 17th, 1868. How can you celebrate Juneteenth in Texas when this was going on in Texas? Arbitrary and random violence. Though black people could become targets of violence for asserting their independence and rights or being accused of crime or social transgressions, some of the most terrifying acts of Reconstruction violence were those that seemed random and arbitrary. Individual black people and families were robbed, harassed, beaten, or killed simply for existing and crossing the paths with the wrong white person at the wrong time. In 1868, Jane Bugg reported to the Freeman's Bureau officials that a group of white men had come to her home in Gallatin, Tennessee, and demanded $200 from her husband, Stephen. When he told the men he didn't have that much money, they beat Mrs. Buggs and her husband, then shot and killed him. A group of white men came to the home of Lewis Powell in Hickman, Tennessee in 1868 and demanded feed for their horses and food for themselves. When Mr. Powell left home to try to avoid the conflict, the white men shot and killed his wife in front of their 3 daughters. In Prince Edward County, Virginia in 1868, 4 black women were at home singing when a white man ordered them to stop. They refused, and the man entered the house, beat the women severely, and cut one of them with a knife. Despite the brutal attack, the man was fined just $15 and issued a judicial warning. Some attacks came without the slightest precipitating conflict. In Fanning County, Texas in 1866, a group of black people were on their way to see a show when a group of white men, to thin the niggers out a little and drive them back to their holes, shot and killed 3 black people and wounded many more. In September of 1869, a group of about 26 African-American men, women, and children were picnicking in Robinson Springs, Florida, when 2 armed white men shot at the group 15 times, instantly killing a black man named Wyatt Young fishing in a nearby creek and a 2-year-old boy named Stuart Livingston. On August 29, 1873, a black man named Dan Calhoun was sleeping near Brighton Station on the Paducah Railroad in Tennessee when 3 white men poured turpentine on his clothes and set him on fire. Mr. Calhoun ran shrieking for help, but suffered severe burns before the fire was extinguished. He died the following day. One of the white men later admitted that he committed this fatal crime just for the fun of seeing the black man jump. During Reconstruction, African Americans experienced freedom and citizenship rights for the first time in national history. But this was a dangerous period during which black people were targeted by white people's intent on throwing progress toward racial equality. Historian Eric Foner described Reconstruction as the darkest page in the saga of American history. In a letter to the Freeman's Bureau in 1868, a black man living in Texas described the hopeless and unprotected status under which many African Americans suffered. I am this morning situated like a mariner whose vessel is sinking, the letter began, and it is dripping out slips of paper, hoping that they might fall into some friendly hands, that the world might know what became of him. This is generally some pretext got up by the rebels for every murder. The would-be social class of rebels stood ever ready to fabricate falsehoods and make excuses for all murders committed by their friends. And that is the end of the chapter 4. Tomorrow will be, on Friday, we'll be picking up chapter 5, Reconstruction's End, on this salute to Bryan Stevenson's Reconstruction in America, the first 6 chapters of violence during Reconstruction. Have a great day.